Hello, good people, and welcome back to Civics Unit 8 on Government and the Economy. This is going to be our seventh and final lesson in our Government and the Economy unit on free trade and globalization. So just a quick recap again, we talked about basic economic principles, circular flow, business cycle, indicators, government and trade advantages, fiscal and monetary policy. We've gone into free trade kind of like a little bit in our global economy lesson, and now we're going to round it out with kind of how globalization looks. So like, what does this mean? What does free trade even mean? How does the U.S. participate in it? And what kind of globalization does and does not do for us in the United States? Probably help if I clicked on the next one. There we go. All right, so the first thing we need to talk about when we discuss free trade is that there is no such thing as full-on free trade. That's not real. There are no like completely free agreements, but you are free in our global economy to kind of trade with who you do and do not like based on your allies and your goals as a government, and kind of your government system as well. So when countries kind of started to develop, I would say maybe like mid 1800s, early 1900s, and kind of into the like post World War II era of the world, some economic organizations started to kind of pop up. So people that do and do not like to trade with one another, and kind of some clumps or some cliques of people that like to trade. All right, so what is an economic organization, or an EO? It's a group of nations who gather to reach or to sustain an agreement that already exists. All right, they can share regions. So for example, like the United States has a particular agreement with Canada and Mexico. There could be like all the countries in Europe have kind of squatted up together to make an economic organization. It could be based on a resource. So for example, like OPEC, the oil and petroleum exporting countries, or even a type of government or a type of economy. So like China fools with North Korea, but kind of on the down low because they're not supposed to. China and Russia kind of get along, and they vibe pretty well because they have very similar types of governments. All right, so the goal of an economic organization is to advance their interests, either their region, the resource they share, or their government types interests, if possible, and no compromise if needed most of the time. So what do they even do? It depends on which one. Some are created to accomplish specific goals like climate change, which is like the G7 and G20 summits, and some are created to advance specific resource interests like OPEC, or oil and petroleum exporting countries. All right. So which parts of the world are involved in this? Venezuela and Ecuador are involved in OPEC. Equatorial Guinea, they're going through it. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Libya, Algeria, Nigeria, Gabon, Angola, Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran are all part of OPEC because they have oil and petroleum. We have some in the United States, but we are not part of OPEC because we don't produce enough to be part of OPEC. All right, and when we talk about like economic organizations versus free trade agreements, they're not quite the same thing. They function in similar ways, but not quite the same. So an economic organization is typically very long lasting. It's more organized. They kind of vibe all together. And then a free trade agreement can be like maybe one or two countries, like 2 or 3 countries, just a few. It can be broken more easily, and there aren't serious legal consequences if you break a free trade agreement. There are serious consequences like for the United Nations and like a country's involvement in the UN and their ability to make decisions on a global scale if they break out or go against an EO. All right, so example like the Caribbean American Free Trade Agreement. So we have signs up here with like El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala, people that are like kind of in Central America. So this is the Central American Free Trade Agreement with us and other nations that are a little bit south of us, but not Mexico. We'll talk about what that is in a second. Gracious, y'all, I'm doing a struggle today. All right, so with major economic organizations, the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, is a big one that you would definitely want to be a part of if you're a nation. It'll get you the ability to like compromise and the ability to kind of speak and negotiate with other countries that might not normally kind of fool with you. All right, so your trade advantages and the way that you have like technology, natural resources, or government regulation, this is where that can really assist you in kind of joining an EO or maybe making a new one that doesn't exist yet. Right? The International Monetary Fund is also another one. It's like a large bank. Not quite the same as a full-on bank, but it's very similar. The G7 Summit, the World Bank, OPEC, like we talked about, is oil and petroleum exporting countries. The G20, which these two are specifically focused on climate change. The European Union is there to advance literally Europe so that they can kind of hang out. Paris 21 agreements, the International Labor Organization, which focuses heavily on workers in different nations, things like that. All right, so the G7, it literally, y'all, means group of 7, just G7. All right, so Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, and the US, and the European Union. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right, so the European Union is, aside from this, a lot of these nations, like France, Germany, and Italy, are part of the European Union. For example, if you have a passport that is a European Union passport, you can literally drive from France across to Germany, around to Poland, through Switzerland, and down into Italy, and you don't have to stop. You can stop at a checkpoint, but you don't have to get your passport stamped because it functions as if you were in the same place. All right, so that's G7 on a map. All right, so let's talk about some impacts on trade that EOs can have. We'll get into free trade agreements in just a moment. But when we talk about the entrance of or the exit of an economic organization, like either one being formed or one breaking apart, can significantly impact the country itself, their neighbors, and maybe also their allies. Right? It can restrict potential trade partners because if you're a part of an economic organization and you're already part of a little clique, economically speaking, maybe other countries don't want to fool with you because they don't like someone else who's in the clique, things like that. All right, so they can be kind of petty sometimes, but I mean, humans can always be petty if they want to be. All right, it can also expand your partners on a more positive note. It can expand the value of your resource that you have to trade or the technology that you have to trade. It can increase demand as well, and there's power in numbers. All right, so some negative consequences of EOs, oligopolies and monopolies, right? So having a few companies that are in charge of everything, or one company that's in charge of everything, or one economic organization, or just a few, that can hurt smaller competitors so that smaller countries who have, maybe they have a natural resource like we do, but they don't have quite enough to be part of OPEC, or they don't have enough to really be competitive, it can really hurt smaller nations and their ability to trade. All right, so not all nations have equal power inside of the EO. Even inside of the G7 summit that we have, we don't necessarily allow other nations to have as much power as we do. So Italy is not going to have an equal say to the United States in G7, all right, which, I mean, is neither here nor there. All right, it can also restrict trade to problematic nations. So we can slap an embargo or slap a sanction on someone as an economic organization and that sort of thing. All right, so this particular cartoon you're going to see again on your test, so please pay specific attention. You can find this on your study guide. All right, so this person is titled Corporate America. That's their name. So Corporate America seems to be a person who is living large. They even have these the fancy button-up shoes. From the 1800s, or really the 1900s. So this person is kind of riffing off of MLK's I Have a Dream speech, kind of towards the end. MLK says, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, as a result of the Civil Rights Movement being passed in 1964. All right, so he is saying, or this person I should say, is saying free trade at last, thank God Almighty, we have free trade at last. However, it doesn't seem like everybody in this photo is benefiting equally. It seems as though U.S. workers and workers abroad are experiencing layoffs, vanishing, or maybe even no workers' rights, and their wages are significantly decreased. But people who are big businesses, which is what corporate means, just a large business, they are really killing it. And then these two are now out-of-date economic organizations, but they are using these economic organizations to restrict the profit and the sustainability of workers. All right, so I'm going to talk about trade and foreign policy. Nations have got to be real picky about who we will and will not trade with. Even if we need a resource, we don't need it that badly if it's going to start a war, okay? So we can abstain from trade. We can stop trading with someone. We can restrict trade to another country because of political reasons, all right? And then specific resources can be kind of tricky because if we need oil, but we don't like the behavior of like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or other like oil producing countries, we still need oil one way or the other, even if we don't like their behavior. So we kind of have to figure out a way to kind of work around that. All right, so one thing that can happen if we dislike behavior of another nation is to slap a sanction on them. All right, not physically slap, you know what I mean. All right, so a sanction is a restriction to trade, all right, like we talked about earlier in trade advantages. And this is using foreign policy tools in order to change behavior, like economic threats, all right? So remember, we stop trading with another. There's about 8,000 total sanctions in the globe currently. They can be either comprehensive or selective. So we can either cut everybody off, like no stuff at all for whatever country we don't like, or we can choose specific things. So we've had a selective sanction on Russia because of their invasion of the Ukraine, and we are moving towards a comprehensive sanction. All right, so people that we've sanctioned so far: Syria, because they're in the middle of a civil war as a result of their previous dictator using like chemical warfare on people; Belarus, who has like tried to break away from the European Union and go towards Russia; Iran for having nuclear weapons; Russia for a host of reasons we know; North Korea for having a dictatorship; Myanmar or Burma having a dictatorship as well; DR Congo, Zimbabwe; Somalia is a failed state. Their government is a mess. Cote d'Ivoire or the Ivory Coast; Libya, Cuba, things like that. So we have quite a few sanctions. All right, so now an embargo is like a sanction on steroids, okay? So it's the most restrictive non-military tool for changing behavior because if we don't want to drop a bomb on someone, we don't want to invade someone via land or like toss the Marines in there or toss a SEAL team in there, all right? An embargo is the way to do that economically speaking. So it's a pact between a country and all their friends to stop trade with another country, particularly because of behavior. All right, so we have put an embargo on Crimea, which is a peninsula in the Ukraine, which has been kind of ceded to the Russian government. It's a lot. There's a lot going on there. Iran, Sudan, North Korea, and Syria. We will not fool with them, period. Even if we need oil from Iran, we will not fool with them. Okay, so an embargo, we completely stop all trade, and we have a comprehensive, we had comprehensive sanctions on them, and now we have moved to an embargo. All right, so when we talk about globalization in trade, when we talk about free trade agreements, we have 14 total across 20 different countries. They're usually done to gain an ally or for a specific resource. For example, we have no reason to trade with Bahrain and Oman other than the fact that they are part of OPEC. They have oil, and we need that. All right, so we have renegotiated our free trade agreement. So it's the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to foster good relationships with our neighbors. It used to be called NAFTA, and we'll get into that in just a moment. So when we talk about free trade in society, there is less of an emphasis on worker rights, safety, and conditions. There can be some environmental repercussions to free trade. So like if you want to like knock down the rainforest, you're free to do so, but you've knocked down the rainforest permanently. So there can be some serious environmental impacts. This can result in job loss, like we talked about outsourcing. And if the main concern is profit, we're less concerned with workers. All right. All right, so when we talk about globalization, we can define this as the movement of people, goods, services, and ideas easily across the globe. All right, so this diversifies the available goods and services that we have. For example, we have avocados and bananas year-round in the United States. We can't grow them year-round here, but because of globalization, we are able to import them from other places year-round. All right, and we can expand these out for resources. Is it helpful? Is it harmful? Is it both? That's up to you. All right, so some positive impacts. We have exchange of culture, language, religion, goods, services that are much more accessible. Y'all, I can have something that is in China currently, like next day shipped to my house in like 48 hours, okay? So definitely a positive impact of globalization. Your access to goods is much more wide and broad. You can build some economic and good political relationships, and we have a positive impact of interdependence. So us depending on other nations for resources. All right, some negative impacts. Obviously, global health issues. Hello, the Rona. All right, economic and political issues get tied together. So, like, yes, we like dislike a behavior that a country is exhibiting. However, we need a resource from them. That can kind of be a little tricky to navigate. Some negative impacts could be like your opportunity cost. So remember talking about that, the value of what you gave up. Outsourcing, any potential problems with that, and maybe some advancement is a little too fast for us sometimes. Right, some winners and losers of globalization. You can pause at any time if you need to. All right, good people. That has been Unit 8, Government and the Economy.